As you settle in, let's begin with a quiet look back at Nintendo's early years. Not at the games we know, but at the ones that slipped away, fading into whispers of what might have been. Cancelled Nintendo games are like ghost stories, glimpses of worlds that almost existed, of ideas left half drawn on the edges of history. And though we never played them, their traces remain, soft and curious, inviting us to imagine what they might have been. One of the earliest known cancelled Nintendo games dates back to the NES era, a time when gaming was still finding its rhythm. Among these was The Legend of Zelda, Mystical Seed of Courage, part of an ambitious trilogy planned for the Game Boy Color. You may know the two games that did release, Oracle of Ages and Oracle of Seasons. But originally, there was to be a third, each game connected, forming a trifecta of interwoven stories. The third entry would have centered around courage, likely starring Link once more, and possibly completing the Triforce theme of power, wisdom, and courage. But as development progressed, the complexity of linking three separate games became overwhelming. Nintendo and Capcom scaled back to just two, leaving this final piece forever missing. Even now, fans wonder what dungeons, what melodies, what secrets were planned but never seen. From Zelda's lost chapter, we drift to a peculiar piece of Nintendo history, Mario Motors for the Nintendo DS. Designed by Nintendo legend Shigeru Miyamoto, this quirky concept would have combined car building with unconventional gameplay. Using the DS's microphone, players would literally blow into it to simulate wind resistance, powering their creations. It was an experiment in odd, physical interaction, something Nintendo is known for. But as prototypes stumbled and the market shifted, Mario Motors was quietly shelved, its strange premise now just an amusing relic of what if? The NES also had its share of mysterious cancellations. One example was a game known only in rumor and design sketches. NES Wars, a planned strategy title meant to be a precursor to what would later become Advance Wars. It would have been radically ahead of its time, grid-based tactical combat on home consoles, in an era when few had seen such things. But memory limitations and the simple difficulty of designing deep strategy for an audience used to platformers likely sealed its fate. As we move forward, we find Super Mario's Wacky Worlds, an ill-fated experiment meant to bring Mario to the Philips CDI, the same system that produced the infamous Zelda CDI games. This was not a mainline Nintendo project, but was outsourced during a strange licensing deal. Wacky Worlds aimed to place Mario in real-world inspired locations like ancient Egypt or the Arctic, exploring stages far removed from the Mushroom Kingdom's familiar landscapes. But the project quickly stalled, and only a prototype remains, a half-built curiosity showing Mario awkwardly leaping through stages that never quite felt alive. And then there was EarthBound 64, also known as Mother 3, for the Nintendo 64 disk drive. This one stings for fans because its ghost still lingers. Initially, it was to be a fully 3D continuation of Shigesato Itoi's beloved Mother series. Previews showed sprawling towns, polygonal characters, and familiar quirkiness, all wrapped in that signature bittersweet tone. But the N64 disk drive itself flopped. The technology couldn't meet expectations, and development dragged on. Eventually, it was canceled outright, though years later, the game would reappear, reborn in 2D on the Game Boy Advance. Yet this original 3D version remains lost, a shadow of what the series might have looked like in a different era, Even Pokemon has its share of vanished projects. Early in development, there was talk of a Pokemon game for the Virtual Boy, Nintendo's ill-fated red and black headset. Very little is known about it. No title, no screenshots, just mentions in developer notes that suggest a spin-off or experimental title was considered. Perhaps it would have been a battle simulator, or maybe a more pared-down adventure, but whatever it was, it disappeared when the Virtual Boy collapsed commercially. The Virtual Boy itself is a story filled with canceled dreams. Dozens of titles were announced but never materialized, including Virtual League Baseball 2 and GoldenEye VB, a version of the iconic shooter reimagined for the system. Imagine for a moment the oddity of GoldenEye's tense corridors rendered in wireframe red and black, your head turning inside that strange headset. These games remain curiosities, ideas left in the ether, locked forever in an alternate version of gaming history. And in those same early days, tucked away in quiet meeting rooms, prototypes like Hyrule Tactics were whispered about. A turn-based Zelda spin-off, similar to chess or grid strategy games, was supposedly discussed internally but never left planning. Whether it was ever fully prototyped is unclear. Perhaps it existed only as sketches, or maybe as a simple test build that faded away once focus returned to mainline Zelda projects. All of these canceled Nintendo games share a strange comfort. They exist in fragments, names, screenshots, prototype cartridges. They leave space for imagination. They remind us that behind every polished release lies a trail of experiments, some abandoned, some transformed, all part of the dreamlike process of creation. Imagine being in those dimly lit rooms, watching early builds flicker on CRT screens, hearing developers discuss ideas that would never quite take flight. There's something soothing about these what-ifs, because they speak not of failure, but of exploration. Nintendo has always been a company willing to try, even if some paths led nowhere. As you let your mind wander, picture those ghostly games, the glowing gold cartridge of mystical seed of courage that never was. Mario standing awkwardly in a frozen Arctic backdrop, a polygonal Lucas exploring an unfinished 3D world in EarthBound 64. These are half-formed dreams, preserved not in play, but in memory and myth. And in the next part, we'll gently move forward into the era of the Super Nintendo and Nintendo 64, where even bigger canceled projects, from forgotten sequels to ambitious experiments, quietly slipped away. As we drift forward in time, we enter the era of the Super Nintendo and the Nintendo 64, where technology opened new doors and imagination seemed limitless. This was a golden age for Nintendo, but even in this thriving period, countless ideas quietly slipped away. Some were sequels that never happened. Others were bold experiments that proved too ambitious. Tonight, we'll wander through these forgotten corridors of Nintendo's history, exploring the games that never reached our hands, but still linger like faint echoes in gaming's collective dream. One of the most famous canceled SNES titles is Super Mario's Wacky Worlds, an unusual project created outside of Nintendo's core studios. Originally intended for the Philips CDI before being reimagined for SNES hardware, it would have placed Mario in surreal, real-world inspired settings. Imagine Mario hopping through ancient Greece, Egypt, or even the Arctic, a stark contrast to the Mushroom Kingdom's playful fantasy. A prototype exists, rough, incomplete, but fascinating. Watching Mario awkwardly traverse icy backdrops or Roman ruins feels almost dreamlike, as if peeking through a window into an alternate timeline where Mario traded Goombas for gladiators. As during this same era, another curious project emerged, Super Donkey Kong, believed to be an early prototype for what eventually became Donkey Kong Country. Early design notes suggested a very different direction, one with hand-drawn art instead of the now famous pre-rendered 3D style. While this early iteration was never completed, its DNA lived on in Rare's stunning visual overhaul. You can almost picture those rougher sprites, simpler animations, a gentler, quieter Donkey Kong before his leap into the vivid jungle we remember. On the SNES, there were whispers of a game called Star Fox 2, a full sequel to the original Star Fox. This one is a rare case. It was completely finished and then canceled. Nintendo, preparing to move onto the Nintendo 64, chose to shelve it rather than release a 3D game that might feel outdated next to the incoming wave of true polygons. For years, it existed only as prototypes and leaked ROMs, until it was finally released officially, decades later, on the SNES Classic. Imagine the strangeness of being a developer in 1995, seeing your completed works locked away simply because technology had outpaced it. Then there's Super Mario RPG 2. After the success of Super Mario RPG on the SNES, fans expected a sequel. Early planning even began, with talks of Square continuing their collaboration with Nintendo. But as Square shifted focus towards Sony and the PlayStation, those plans dissolved. What eventually came instead was Paper Mario on the Nintendo 64, spiritual successor rather than direct sequel. It's soothing to imagine that alternate reality, a continuation of Mario's RPG journey with Square's lush pixel art and iconic music, frozen in a timeline we never entered. The Nintendo 64 brought even bigger cancellations. Most famous of all was EarthBound 64, later known simply as the scrapped 3D version of Mother 3. It was first announced for the Nintendo 64 disk drive, the 64DD, showing polygonal towns and early renders of familiar characters. Magazines at the time printed grainy screenshots, promising a fully explorable, quirky world in 3 dimensions. But the 64-update failed commercially, and hardware limitations made development a nightmare. For years, fans waited, but the project quietly shifted, transformed, and ultimately returned to 2D on the Game Boy Advance. That original vision, Lucas wandering a low-poly world under the glow of early N64 lighting, remains forever unfinished. Speaking of the 64DD, this add-on itself was a machine filled with ghostly titles. One was Cabbage, a strange virtual pet game designed by a team that included Shigeru Miyamoto and Tsunekazu Ishihara, who later became president of the Pokemon Company. Cabbage would have allowed players to raise a small creature using connectivity with the Game Boy to care for it on the go. Early reports described creatures reacting to seasons and even music, but as the 64DD stumbled and Pokemon exploded in popularity, its ideas were folded into other projects. Many believe Cabbage's DNA lives on quietly in games like Nintendo's or even the Pokemon series itself. Another canceled 64D project was Mario Artist, a planned creative suite meant to follow up Mario Paint. Pieces of it did release, such as Mario Artist, Paint Studio, but several connected applications never left Japan or were canceled entirely. Among them was Polygon Studio, which would have let players create their own 3D models, and Talent Studio, where you could scan faces to animate characters. It's peaceful to imagine sitting in 1999, tinkering with these tools late at night, crafting clumsy polygons in that quiet space between game and toy. One of the strangest lost N64 concepts was Zelda Gaiden, an early version of what eventually became Majora's Mask. Early builds suggested a very different experience, using Ocarina of Time's engine, but with experiments in time mechanics and altered dungeons. At one point, it was described as a side story Zelda featuring multiple smaller scenarios rather than a single sprawling quest. While these pieces ultimately evolved into the eerie world of Termina, it's haunting to think of those cut locations and alternate puzzles, forever hidden behind locked developer archives. And then, quietly tucked into magazines and trade shows, there were games like Kirby Bowl 64, an early name for what fans assumed would be a sequel to Kirby's Dream Course. Instead, it shifted and morphed into Kirby 64, the Crystal Shards, leaving behind whatever that early, more experimental Kirby title was meant to be. These canceled games of the SNES and N64 era feel almost cozy in their absence. They belong to an age when games were announced through blurry screenshots in magazines, when months of anticipation could be built around a single paragraph of text and a logo that might never materialize. There's something comforting in that, in the slow mystery of it all. Imagine holding an old issue of Nintendo Power, reading about a game like Cabbage, or seeing images of EarthBound 64, wondering when it would arrive. Those quiet evenings, dreaming of games that never came, feel almost as nostalgic as the ones we actually played. As we rest here, let's drift gently onward. In the next part, we'll explore Nintendo's GameCube and Wii eras, when bold experiments and shifting technologies birthed some of the most fascinating canceled games of all. As we move gently into the early 2000s, Nintendo entered the GameCube era, a time defined by bold creativity, yet also by experiments that didn't always take root. Many of these canceled games feel like glimpses into parallel worlds, projects with early footage or whispered mentions that disappeared as quietly as they arrived. Tonight, let's slowly walk through some of the most fascinating, canceled Nintendo games of this era, each one a dream frozen in place. One of the most well-known lost projects is Stage Debut, a quirky game planned for the GameCube that would have used a special camera accessory to map players' faces onto characters in-game. This was long before Nintendo's Mii avatars on the Wii. Early screenshots showed players' faces placed on polygonal characters in minigames and humorous scenarios. It was a strange and playful concept, ahead of its time, but ultimately shelved. Many of its ideas resurfaced later in the Wii's Mii channel and games like Tomodachi Life, but the original Stage Debut never emerged. During this period, Nintendo also experimented with concepts that pushed beloved franchises in unexpected directions. One such example was Super Mario 128. Initially shown as a tech demo during Space World 2000, it displayed dozens of tiny Mario characters running around a sphere-like surface, demonstrating the GameCube's processing power. When fans speculated endlessly, was this the next Mario game? In truth, Super Mario 128 was never a game, but its experimental physics engine and spherical terrain became the foundation for Super Mario Galaxy years later. While not technically canceled, it exists as a Phantom prototype, bridging the gap between eras. Another lost GameCube gem is Metroid Prime Hunter's Prototype, an early build separate from the DS game we eventually received. This version, developed alongside Retro Studios' work on Metroid Prime, aimed to bring Samus into smaller, experimental missions, focusing more on multiplayer-style combat. As development shifted, the project transformed and eventually settled on the handheld DS platform, but this early GameCube prototype hinted at what a console-focused, combat-heavy Metroid spin-off might have been. We also can't forget EarthBound 64, which, though already discussed in its N64 form, lingered briefly into the GameCube's early years. There were quiet murmurs of reviving it on the new console, but these whispers faded quickly. Instead, Mother 3 emerged later on the Game Boy Advance, leaving behind the dream of exploring its odd, melancholy world in full 3D. The GameCube also saw Marionette, a mysterious project Shigeru Miyamoto teased in interviews. Its concept was never fully explained, but it involved players controlling puppet-like characters in a whimsical world, possibly focused on creative play rather than traditional objectives. Miyamoto described it as something entirely new, not tied to any existing franchise. And yet, after years of silence, Marionette quietly vanished, never officially canceled, but never spoken of again. One of the most haunting cancellations from this time is Project H.A.M.M.E.R. Originally revealed for the Wii, it showcased a powerful robotic hero wielding a massive hammer, battling hordes of mechanical enemies. It promised intense motion controls, letting players swing the Wii remote to smash through waves of robots. Early footage suggested a gritty, futuristic style, a stark contrast to Nintendo's typically colorful tone. But over time, reports emerged of troubled development and changing creative direction. Eventually, it was shelved entirely, becoming one of the Wii's most infamous lost titles. Another Wii-era project was Sonic DOS, a Nintendo DS game concept teased during the handheld's reveal. This prototype showed Sonic controlled entirely through touch input, with players drawing paths for him to follow on the dual screens. While Sega ultimately shifted focus to Sonic Rush, this early demo represents one of the stranger crossovers in Nintendo history. Sonic, once a rival mascot, showcased as part of Nintendo's future. In these years, we also saw Donkey Kong Racing, originally announced for the GameCube and later intended to move to the Wii. This game was a spiritual successor to Diddy Kong Racing, but placed riders on the backs of various jungle animals like rhinos and swordfish. After Rare was acquired by Microsoft, development fractured, and while fragments reportedly became a prototype called Saberman Stampede, it never saw completion. The image of Donkey Kong riding Rambi through lush jungles remains a charming what-if, burned into the memories of those who saw its trailer. The Wii era also birthed curious experiments, like Wii Crush, a rumored physics-based game showcasing the Wii Remote's motion sensing. Though never confirmed, patents and tech demos from this period hint at Nintendo exploring smaller, stranger ideas that blurred the line between toy and game, the kind of playful invention that sometimes simply doesn't fit into a final product. We also can't forget Project Sora's early works, which predated Kid Icarus, Uprising. Before settling on reviving Pit for the Nintendo 3DS, Masahiro Sakurai reportedly experimented with several unrelated prototypes, ranging from experimental shooters to physics-driven action games. None of these prototypes left Nintendo's walls, but pieces of their DNA likely informed Uprising's creative mechanics. Even the Legend of Zelda saw cut concepts during this time. After Twilight Princess, Nintendo explored ideas for a more realistic follow-up, including designs featuring adult Link in darker, moodier environments. Ultimately, these plans evolved into the watercolor-inspired Skyward Sword. Early concept art, however, suggests a completely different aesthetic direction once lingered in the halls of Nintendo, one we'll never fully see. Each of these games feels like a lantern glimpsed in the dark, warm, flickering, but just out of reach. The GameCube and Wii eras were experimental, full of bold ideas that sometimes didn't coalesce into finished products. And yet their whispers remain through leaked artwork, magazine previews, and quiet interviews, fragments that invite us to dream. As you rest, picture yourself in those old days, flipping through gaming magazines filled with grainy screenshots of Project H.A.M.M.E.R. or seeing Donkey Kong ride Rambi in an E3 trailer that would never lead anywhere. There's a peaceful nostalgia in those memories, not of what was, but of what could have been. In the next part, we'll drift gently into the era of the Nintendo DS, 3DS, and Wii U, where ambitious handheld experiments and shifting consoles brought even more games that never came to be. As we continue into the era of the Nintendo DS, 3DS, and Wii U, we step into a period defined by dual screens, touch controls, and bold experiments that blurred the lines between consoles and handhelds. Nintendo was trying new things, and with each new system came a wave of ideas. Some became beloved classics, while others quietly faded away, leaving only traces behind. Tonight, we wander through the ones that slipped through our fingers, lingering like distant memories of games we almost played. One of the most intriguing canceled DS games was Metroid Dread. Rumored for years, it became almost mythological among fans. Reportedly planned as a 2D Metroid game in the style of Metroid Fusion, it was said to be nearly finished before being shelved. Mentions of it even appeared as an Easter egg in Metroid Prime 3, Corruption, with a mysterious in-game message referencing Project Dread is nearing completion. Players scoured for answers, but none came. Only much later did Nintendo revive the name, releasing Metroid Dread on the Switch. But it was an entirely new project, not the lost DS game whispered about in hushed tones. Another DS project lost to time was Mario vs. Donkey Kong, Tipping Star's predecessor. A more ambitious version planned to fully utilize online features, allowing for extensive level sharing before the infrastructure existed to support it properly. It was quietly scaled back, its original scope lost, leaving only remnants of its ideas in the simpler final release. The DS also had an unusual canceled title known as The Legend of Zelda: Mystical Seed of Courage, once intended to complete the Oracle trilogy. Although it began on Game Boy Color, it was briefly discussed internally for a DS revival. It would have tied together Oracle of Ages and Oracle of Seasons with a third adventure centered around courage. But connecting three linked games proved too complex, and so this final chapter of Zelda's planned trilogy never arrived, leaving only two shimmering pieces of a puzzle that was never fully completed. On the Nintendo 3DS, there were several fascinating cancellations. One such project was Animal Crossing for Wii U, sometimes referred to by fans as Animal Crossing Plaza. Nintendo initially teased a more expansive console version of Animal Crossing that would integrate deeply with Miiverse and HD visuals. Instead, it appeared only briefly as a simple social hub on the Wii U dashboard, more of a glimpse than a game. The full vision, a bustling HD village connected to friends' towns in seamless ways, never fully manifested, only re-emerging years later in Animal Crossing: New Horizons. The 3DS era also teased us with Mario and Luigi, Paper Jam's predecessor, an early hybrid RPG concept that would have merged the Mario and Luigi series with Paper Mario much earlier. Internal builds reportedly experimented with dual combat styles and even two playable Marios, a papercraft version and his standard self. While some of this resurfaced later in Paper Jam, the original, more ambitious crossover was pared down significantly. We also can't forget Project Giant Robot, a quirky Wii U game revealed by Shigeru Miyamoto. Players would build towering robots, then pilot them in slow, deliberate battles using the Wii U gamepad's gyroscopic controls. Demos showed clunky but charming mechanics, with massive machines stumbling through cities and grappling each other. Though it shared DNA with another experiment, Star Fox Guard, Project Giant Robot was eventually canceled after years of silence, existing only as a curious E3 memory. One of the strangest Wii U cancellations was Zelda U's early prototypes. Before becoming Breath of the Wild, the Zelda team tested numerous concepts: a fully linear dungeon crawler in HD, a photorealistic version reminiscent of Twilight Princess, and even one prototype that reportedly included a hookshot-based traversal system across massive cliffs. These experiments eventually coalesced into Breath of the Wild's open-world design, but those discarded fragments, an ultra-realistic Zelda in the Wii U's twilight years, remain a haunting what if. The Wii U also had whispers of Mario Galaxy 3. Fans hoped for another entry in the beloved series, and early art leaks suggested Nintendo at least explored the idea, but the studio pivoted instead to Super Mario 3D World. Though that game was charming and colorful, the thought of soaring through cosmic planets once more, with the gamepad's unique mechanics, became yet another dream lost to time. Another quiet cancellation was Luigi's Mansion Arcade for Wii U. Based on Capcom's arcade spin-off, plans briefly existed to adapt it into a home title using the Wii Remote as a poltergust vacuum. It lingered in internal discussions, but never surfaced, its ghostly concept fittingly vanishing like Luigi's haunted foes. Even Pokemon had its share of lost projects during this time. A mysterious Pokemon MMO was reportedly in planning stages for the Wii U, combining open-world exploration with online features. While never confirmed officially, former developers have hinted at early prototypes that tested shared world connectivity decades before Pokemon Scarlet and Violet introduced larger multiplayer areas. The DS era also gave birth to oddities like Kirby Tilt and Tumble 2, planned for the GameCube and later shifted to DS with motion sensing features. It was quietly canceled, but its playful idea, rolling Kirby by tilting the entire system, resurfaced years later in other experimental titles. These handheld and Wii U cancellations feel softer than those of earlier eras. They existed in fleeting demos, cryptic interviews, or passing mentions that faded as quickly as they appeared. Yet that fleeting nature is what makes them strangely soothing. They're like little daydreams Nintendo once had set down gently, and never picked up again. Picture the gentle glow of a 3DS screen late at night, imagining what Metroid Dread could have been, or recall the empty Miiverse Plaza on Wii U, wondering what a full Animal Crossing HD might have looked like if it had blossomed. There's a hushed comfort in thinking about these digital dreams frozen mid-breath. In our final part, we'll move into the modern era, from the Nintendo Switch to today, and look at recent cancellations and hidden prototypes that show even now Nintendo's vault of what could have been is still quietly growing. As we arrive in the modern era, with the Nintendo Switch dominating living rooms and handheld play alike, it might seem as if canceled games are a relic of the past. But even today, Nintendo's vault of unrealized projects continues to grow. These recent cancellations feel closer, fresher, titles teased in trailers or whispered about in interviews that quietly slipped away, leaving only traces. Tonight, we'll rest in those echoes, letting them carry us into sleep like a lullaby of what-ifs. One of the most famous modern cancellations is Pikmin 4. Shigeru Miyamoto first mentioned the game in 2015, stating it was very close to completion. Years passed, but nothing came. Fans speculated endlessly. Had it been delayed, reworked, or entirely scrapped? While Hey Pikmin released on 3DS as a side project, the true fourth mainline entry lingered in limbo for nearly a decade before finally re-emerging on Switch as Pikmin 4. But what about that earlier build? Did it resemble the finished game, or was it an entirely different take, buried quietly in Nintendo's archives? Another quiet loss was Project Giant Robot, which, though discussed earlier in its Wii U context, lingered well into the Switch transition. At one point, reports suggested it might have been retooled for Nintendo's newer hardware. Its concept, slow, methodical battles between towering machines, fit the experimental spirit Nintendo loves. But ultimately, it was shelved, remembered now only through brief E3 footage of lurching, clumsy robots tilting with the gamepad's gyroscope. The Star Fox Grand Prix rumor was another that captivated fans. Leaks suggested Retro Studios, developers of Metroid Prime, were working on a futuristic racing game blending Star Fox's universe with F-Zero's speed. The idea of piloting R-Wings in high-octane racing circuits, battling rivals across space-themed tracks, felt bold and playful. But despite concept art leaks and insider whispers, the project never surfaced. Whether it was real or not, it remains an alluring phantom, a game we can almost see, almost feel, but never truly play. The F-Zero series itself is a story of cancellations. Once a showcase for speed and futuristic style, it's been dormant for years. Nintendo insiders have hinted at prototypes and pitches, ideas for motion-controlled F-Zero, or even open-world reimaginings, but none progressed past internal discussions. Imagine those neon-lit tracks rendered in Switch hardware, the sensation of velocity and silence. It's peaceful to think about a version of F-Zero gliding eternally in some developer's private test room, untouched. We also saw murmurs of Zelda spin-offs that never materialized. During Breath of the Wild's development, Nintendo reportedly experimented with prototypes focusing solely on climbing, cooking, or even survival mechanics. One small build focused entirely on playing as a young Zelda herself. These micro-experiments fed into the final game's design, but the standalone concepts were abandoned. Yet imagining those intimate slices, A Zelda who isn't battling but simply exploring feels oddly soothing, like watching a fragment of a dream that never fully woke up. Mario and Luigi fans also felt the sting of cancellation. After the closure of Alpha Dream, the studio behind the beloved RPG series, reports emerged that an unannounced new entry had been in early development. Concept art showed fresh designs and new settings, but with Alpha Dream gone, it quietly dissolved. The thought of another whimsical, dialogue-heavy Mario RPG, lost just before it could be born, adds another layer of wistfulness to Nintendo's library of ghosts. Then there's Project X, an internal code name occasionally referenced in leaked documents. Its details remain elusive. Some claim it was an experimental multiplayer platformer. Others suggest it was tied loosely to Splatoon's early mechanics. Whatever it was, it faded without so much as a screenshot, leaving only the title floating like a blank page in Nintendo's history. Even in the Pokemon series, cancellations persist. Early prototypes of Pokemon Sword and Shield reportedly included scrapped towns, cut gym leaders, and even unused Pokemon designs. Data mining reveals creatures like Gorochu, Raichu's unused evolution, lingering as sketches and code fragments. Each one hints at roads untaken, entire regions of ideas pruned away to shape what we eventually played. Nintendo has also dabbled with VR over the years. Quiet patents describe experiments for a VR-compatible Switch with test environments resembling Mario Kart and Metroid Prime, while Nintendo Labo VR offered a playful, simplified version. The more ambitious projects seemingly never left the lab. The idea of exploring Breath of the Wild's fields in immersive VR remains a calming thought, a world we could step into, but never did. One of the most evocative lost concepts came from Monolith Soft, the studio behind Xenoblade Chronicles. Before creating Breath of the Wild's open-world foundation, Monolith pitched Nintendo an original fantasy action game. Early art showed towering mountains, medieval towns, and vast, misty forests. While it ultimately evolved into contributions toward Zelda's world design, this standalone project, an entirely new IP, quietly disappeared, leaving only concept pieces and faint mentions in interviews. Even the Switch's rumored Pro model has sparked canceled game theories. Developers reportedly received dev kits hinting at higher specifications, leading to speculation that certain titles may have been planned specifically for a more powerful Switch before Nintendo pivoted. Games like Metroid Prime 4, still deep in development, seem to echo from those shifting plans, suspended between what was once imagined and what is yet to come. In these modern cancellations, we see fewer bold public announcements and more whispers, quiet internal projects, prototypes we'll never see, and passing mentions from developers reflecting on roads not taken. They exist in hidden rooms, test servers, concept art files tucked away on hard drives, pieces of Nintendo's boundless curiosity. As we near the end of our journey, imagine all of these games together, resting side by side in a quiet digital vault. An unfinished Metroid Dread build running on a DAS dev kit, an early Zelda prototype set in a tiny grassy field, R-Wings racing endlessly on a mock-up Star Fox Grand Prix track. They sit there in frozen time, unplayed but still alive in some small way. Nintendo's history is a balance of what was made and what was dreamed, and in those unmade dreams lies a certain tranquility. They remind us that imagination itself is endless, and that sometimes the most comforting stories are the ones we only half know, the ones left unfinished so our minds can gently wander through them. And as you rest, let those lost titles blur together like half remembered memories. Zelda in strange dungeons that never were, Mario racing through worlds we'll never see, and Pokemon who exist only as sketches in notebooks. They are quiet companions for the night, unplayed but never truly gone. Sleep now and drift through those unseen worlds, carried softly by what might have been.